As I was preparing to embark on the new fieldwork project, I was beginning to do interviews for that project in England and France. I was also involved in another project that came out of some time I spent in Australia in 1993, working with Jerry Ward, my friend from the ANU, and Tim O'Meara and some others who were interested. Tim was working on land tenure in Samoa. There was another woman working on land tenure in Tonga. We all got together, and this book came out in 1995, which was Land and Custom in Pacific Societies. We each did a chapter, and we wrote it in a wonderful way. The writing took place in 1993. And we all gathered at Jerry Ward's and Marion's house in Canberra. It was one of those little towns within Canberra, and spent a better part of a month writing and then reading each other's pieces and then revising. And it created a very integrated volume and some great conversations. A good bit of wine was consumed. And they had a swimming pool at their place in Canberra, and they had a beach house at Lillipilli. And I learned a few things from Jerry on that writing experiment. And one was the benefit of having people in the same room with each other when they're writing, the opportunity to read each other's stuff and to improve one's own through that process. I also learned the benefits of taking frequent breaks, which he did always. So we'd write, and then we'd agree to meet at lunchtime, and then we'd write, and then we'd agree at 4:00 we'd take a walk, and we'd go out and we'd collect all sorts of interesting specimens from the beach at Lillipilli or whatever, and then we'd work some more, and then we'd have tea, and then we'd work some more, and then we'd finally have dinner, and it was productive to punctuate the day like that. So it was a very good experience. So that was in 1995. Meanwhile, I was in 93 and 94 beginning the research for the book that became Houses Far From Home. And I'll talk about that in a minute. I was also editing a book with Jan Rensel from the University of Hawaii on housing in the islands. And it came through the ASAO process, and it came out looking like that from the University of Hawaii Press in 97, I think it was. We worked really well together. It was a nice partnership. She was working in copy editing at the time as well as being an anthropologist. So she was very valuable that way, and we did this all long distance. It was one of the first projects that I did almost entirely by email, and that we did with the contributors, because it was before that had been impossible. So it looked at it applied this kind of method that I was thinking about more and more, of looking at houses as socially constructed containers that tell us a great deal about their inhabitants. And for example, one of the chapters is about Samoan housing in Samoa, and then what happens when Samoans move to high-rise apartments in Los Angeles or Honolulu, and how the visual openness of a Samoan house actually minimizes or helps to dampen the frequency of domestic violence, because you have more people with more eyes on things. And the privacy of a high-rise can be bad for the safety of women, and it's also really isolating. So the ability to connect with each other easily was lost, and it led to kind of fractured families, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So this was keeping my ties in the Pacific active, and then I was doing research in England and France, and then I ended up back in Vanuatu. The English and French work was very interesting. It's similar in some ways to this CASCA project of filming anthropologists talking about their lives. And what I did was working with a British man from Birmingham who had a lot of experience in the colonial New Hebrides as a lands officer and other jobs. I, through him, contacted probably over 100 former British colonial servants who had retired to the UK and Wales, well, to the UK, so mostly in England, a couple in Wales, and went with this fellow who served as a research assistant for me to the people's homes and asked them to tell me about the homes that they had lived in the islands. So what was their, what kind of housing did they have? What were the issues around it? And who were the people in their lives that they remembered through the housing? This was something people had never been asked about. They were asked about their time in the islands, but not about their houses. So it was fresh in that sense, because there were quite a few of the more eminent colonial officers who had a bunch of stories that you could tell from the way they told them often. And to ask them about and they were good stories, but to ask them about their housing opened new information up. So we did that and collected a huge amount of information, and not only verbal information, but we had people look. I had a video camera, my first video camera, and I looked over their shoulders at their photo albums as they're describing them, which was also very rich, and asked them to draw their houses, like draw maps of floor plans and of the area that they were in, and some of them are in the book, and they were lovely, just lovely. One is a watercolor done on British Airways of the home that they lived in Port Vila, and so I was able to experiment with some new ways of gathering anthropological data. The project culminated with fieldwork in Vanuatu in 1995, and I traveled all over to places I'd never been in Vanuatu, all over the islands, looking at the ruins of old homes, at the reuse of colonial homes by indigenous people, and even the reuse of the British paddock, and the French resident commissioner's house had been repurposed as the president's house, and so on. And it was really intriguing. So I was able to work a lot of that into the book as well. We even went by sailboat to Epi Island, which at the time was difficult to get to by air, and looked at some of the old plantation housing there. Epi had at one time been more populous place than the capital, Port Vila. They had a racetrack. It was a happening place, but by the 90s it was a real backwater. So that was fun to do and a very productive piece of field work. The book that came out of all of this work with colonial officers was Houses Far From Home, British Colonial Space in the New Hebrides, and it was published in 2001 also by University of Hawaii Press, which had published Home in the Islands. And it took me a long time to get to the writing of it. I'd done the fieldwork in 95, most of it. But eventually, when I finally got down to it, it went quickly. I mean, what had to happen was getting the first chapter. And once I had the first chapter, which started with our own home in the islands, our home in Wailingi Village, the bamboo and thatch with a bamboo floor, the rest of it just flowed. Because in the meantime, in the late 90s, my marriage had ended. So I've been married for 30 years or more. And for a while, I kind of lost those shared memories. It was just difficult. So I had a lot of information I was finding it hard to write about. And then suddenly writing about that home grounded me in a way that allowed me to go forward with it. So my advice to people writing is always find the easy entry point. For me, it happened to be the beginning of that book, but I remember my dissertation started with chapter 3. That was the one that was easy to write, so that's where I started. So start with the easy stuff. In my experience, is the most productive way to go. And the book just flowed from there, and each chapter is a different house or a different building. Let's put it that way. So it has, it has the British residency, which was fun to do. A chapter about a prison, a chapter about a building called the White House in the British paddock, and a haunted house on Tanna Island, and then one about a house on a little island off of a bigger island, and it was a planter's home there, and the relationship between that and the larger society. So it drew on all of the interviews from all over the place, including some in Vanuatu, but mostly Britain and France. That was the sort of the end of that chapter, I think, in my professional career. I did a lot more writing about houses and housing. I began a project that was entirely different to that, but I guess you wouldn't say it was, but it felt different to me. I began an interview project with settler families. These were people whose families had, or usually their grandfather or somebody like that, had come out from the UK or from France or Corsica or New Caledonia or Tahiti and settled in the islands, often brought a wife with them or intermarried with islanders. And at the time of independence, they were evicted, basically. They had to leave. There was a rebellion. They were not welcome. And for some of these people, they were basically stateless. They didn't have they couldn't get a Vanuatu passport because it was just, that was just becoming possible, and they weren't wanted, they were deported. And they didn't have citizenship elsewhere. So not so much for the French, because I think they all had French citizenship, but for the Anglophones, it was a very challenging time, and they ended up, some of them in Australia, feeling not very welcome there, especially the ones who were visibly mixed race, because Australia even then was not a very tolerant place in that regard. So I was interested in their side of the colonial story, and they were often the ones who just didn't get much attention except by people like James Michener and Tales of the South Pacific, right, where the planters and the settlers received a lot of attention. I've developed some good friendships in Australia with descendants of settler families, and began collecting stories that interconnected with other stories. So I was piecing together colonial history. And one way I did that was to connect the stories I was hearing from people with the stories that I was finding in the archives. I was doing research on the New Hebrides British service files. Initially, they were held in a high security facility, don't ask me why, in Milton Keynes in England. And you had to get a security clearance both from the British government and the Vanuatu government to go there. And so when I began that work, it took quite a long time to get the permissions. Now the same files are available in open collections at the University of New Zealand, or the University of Auckland, better said. But at the time, they were really, really valuable, and I was able to pass them on. The ones that I had been able to get copies of, I was able to pass on to my students who were working in Vanuatu. I wrote a couple of articles out of the connection between the living interviews and the archives, and one of them was called something like "Armed Only with a Pencil," and it's about the imprisonment of an officer going and imprisoning a local person, armed only with a pencil, and I could only take a pencil into the archives, so that was part of the story, and the prisons were fascinating in Vanuatu because they were not really prisons, I guess you could say. They did lock the doors at night, but the prisoners were the maintenance crew at the British paddock. They were the ones who took their bush knives and went around cutting the grass. So they were not only out of their cells, they were armed. And they were the ones who entertained the children of the British colonial people. So they would go and visit. And there was one wonderful story I collected about a little boy visiting the prisoners and sharing his comic books with them. The other paper that came out of that was just wonderful to write and hopefully to read was called A Heart in the Archives. And it was about a correspondence between a Ni Vanuatu, well, she couldn't write actually, but between one of the Stevens family, John Stevens, and that was a mixed-race settler family descended from a Tongan princess and an English sea captain. And one of the family led the revolution in Vanuatu, the rebellion. Rearrange the books here. And this was another member of the family who had fallen head over heels in love with a Ni Vanuatu girl and was getting himself into all sorts of trouble with her family and his family because of it. And so the correspondence is between John Stevens, the protagonist, and the local priest, Presbyterian missionary, the British government, and then the person who's not on paper is the Ni Vanuatu woman. So I was curious to see what I could learn between the lines about who she really was and how she figured in all of this. And there's some dramatic moment where he rides into her village on a horse, probably white, and she jumps up behind him and they gallop away. It didn't end happily, but it sure was a good story. And there was a heart on one of his love letters to the intermediary who would read the love letters to the girl. And it was a heart at the top of the page that just stopped me in the archives as I was going through document after document. So the heart in the archives was another paper that came out of that. So this settler study was going on in the late 90s. I never wrote a book out of it, but I had these lovely articles that came together. In 2001, I began work on at the same time as The Houses Far From Home was published. I was fortunate enough to be able to get funding, again from Sooke, to convene a workshop in Vanuatu of 21 Ni Vanuatu women. So that my master's thesis had focused on women, and my last book ended up focusing on women as well. The Cultural Center by that time had not only a men's field workers program, but also a women's field worker program. And Lysant Bolton, an Australian who is at the British Museum, was the person who trained the women field workers. And she had worked with a Ambai woman named Jean Terry Sese when Lysant was doing her doctoral field work. They became a great partnership in training the local women. So they had training workshops, just as the men field workers did, where they would come in from all over the islands. They would come in to Port Vila for a week or even 2 weeks, I think some of them were, week-long training workshop. And they'd be trained in some technique, and they would have a particular project. It could be mat weaving, for example. They were very practical projects. They would go back home. They would interview women in their villages about that topic, and then they would report back. Or they would interview them before the workshop and present the results there. So it was having the same effect that the men's workshops had had. It was training this whole core of people to be curators of their own culture. And they were happy to take as their topic for 2001 house girls, which is the word, it's huisgel in Bislama, for female domestic servants. And we had about half of the group of 21 were women field workers, some of whom had worked as house girls in the colonial era. That was our focus, although it slipped a bit, but the focus was the colonial period. And the other half were women that they had brought. And some of these women had never been to town before. It was a big, somewhat scary, but exciting outing for them. So we did things like go to the local theater company and have cultural events. And we met in a classroom at an agricultural college and the cultural center audio recorded it, and I videotaped it. And hour after hour, they gave their testimony, basically, about what it had been like to be a house girl working for colonial masters. Some of the masters were French, some were English, some were Chinese, and one was Vietnamese. And we looked at, we analyzed, we transcribed all of those audio recordings, first into Bislama and then into English. We'd hoped to be able to publish the book in both Bislama and English, but that didn't turn out to be possible. And then we looked for the themes in the book, and some of the more interesting things, well, there were a number of interesting things. One of the interesting things was the way that their stories interfaced with the stories I'd collected from the colonial officers' side and the settlers' side. And for me, the best was when a woman from Pentecost Island told a story that intersected with one told by a planter woman about the death of a baby. It was during a hurricane, and the woman, the house girl, had been holding a baby in her arms, and it had been swept away. And it wasn't the person telling the story had heard it from an old woman who lived in the village and wasn't able to travel anymore, but it was the same woman. And so that story, I wrote an article called Traveling Stories about what you could learn from the different sides of the story, and how they were the same and yet different. Another interesting thing that came out of the House Girls workshop was that they saw the huge value in the work that they were doing. They were really proud of the work that they did. Both the housework, keeping a place really well, and looking after children, which was a large part of their job. Many had developed really close relationships with the children, and with the families. So had visited them both. They visited both ways, to Australia and in the islands. Some of the families had been very generous and helpful and paid medical bills and really been there for them in times of crisis. And others were just horrible employers. And what the women reported as disliking the most was not being beaten, but being talked to in an angry way. So when these expats would yell at them, and I'm afraid there was a Chinese missus who was deemed to be the worst, so it wasn't just the British and the French, but when they would talk angrily with their employees, it was so painful. And one woman said, "I wish she had hit me. I could have taken that better. But she talked at me." And so they would often leave. Vanuatu culture is very conflict averse. I mean, aren't we all? But they really, really are uncomfortable with that kind of speaking, and especially swearing at each other and this sort of thing. And so that was a real downside. They also agreed that actually conditions were worse now for house girls than they had been prior to independence. And one of my students, Daniela Kramer, wrote her master's thesis on house girls today, which was at that time was the early 2000s. Because the workshop was in 2001 and the book didn't come out until 2007. But house girls today were worse off because they didn't have a live-in accommodation. In the colonial period, they could live in house girl quarters, servants' quarters, which were usually detached at the back of a master's house. And so they had a solid place to live. They could live there as single women and not be afraid of anybody getting in their face. And they could pretty much come and go as they wanted. And they got food. So they could take meals. When the family ate, they ate. And post-independence, none of that was happening. So they had freedom, but much less security, and the wages were still terrible. So Daniela did some awareness-raising work around improving the conditions for domestic labor. The book came together pretty mostly during a wonderful time at the Rockefeller Center in Bellagio in Italy, which was in 2002. I got a Rockefeller Fellowship for Lysant and myself and Jean Terry Sesse, who was her Vanuatu counterpart, other part of the women's training, fieldwork training program, for the three of us to meet on Lake Como at Bellagio for 2 weeks to work on the book. And if the ANU in the 80s was the most exciting intellectual place I'd ever been, Bellagio in 2002 was even better. It was just remarkable. The philosopher Charles Taylor was there, a couple of American historians, some very talented artists who were on their way to the Vienna Biennale, musicians, and we were treated, all of us, like royalty. Jean loved it. She had to actually, buy a suit and get used to wearing shoes every day. She laughed about. We were, it was it's a villa, the Villa Serbelloni, and it's just above the town of Bellagio, so you could walk into town and buy gelato and all that stuff. And they provide accommodation and all of your meals, and the meals are served in many courses with footmen and so on. And then after dinner we would have talks and exchange ideas, and if there were musicians they would play the piano and people would sing, and wow, it was fantastic. And we had a lot of picnics in an olive grove, and we got a lot of work done. So that after that it was just a question of finding the time in our schedules to complete the editing and deal with the questions about illustrations and so on. So that I'm very grateful to the Rockefeller Foundation for that one. I went back to Vanuatu in 2006 with my new husband John, and we went to, there was a gathering of everyone who had done research in Vanuatu was invited to attend this gathering in 2006.